So folks, it's time for some more custom cards, and this time around, Wailing Caverns themed cards that I asked you to make a couple weeks ago. Now, some of these won't make much sense in the context of the cards that have already been revealed for Wailing Caverns, but nonetheless still fun to take a look at the ideas that could have been or compare these to the real versions of cards. This video is sponsored by Keeps, which we'll talk about a little later. For now, let's take a look at this crazy card you've probably already been going, what? For the last 30 seconds. This is a version of Naralex from Verdan. It's a 3 mana, 30 attack minion with 5 health and charge. You thought Leroy was a problem. Wait till you see Naralex. But there's of course a caveat here. This minion is asleep until you've ended your turn 5 times. So pretty crazy idea here. And this plays into the lore of Naralex and Wailing Caverns. You're trying to wake this dude up because he's been asleep. And in particular with this card, the goal, of course, is to keep this minion alive, basically, through 5 of your opponent's turns, so that then you'll get to attack for 30 damage. So you can envision a few ways to maybe do this, right? You could start buffing up the health of Naralex and hoping that your opponent, say, doesn't have any hard removal. You could try to give this stealth over multiple turns, perhaps in a class like Rogue with all the stealth for 1 turn sort of effects that exist. There are, of course, ways and possibilities to do that. I have not mapped out if this is like easily solvable, if there's like some chain of stealth cards that's just too easy to make this go off, or some crazy buffs or other shenanigan I can't think of. So there's some game-breaking mechanism here where Naralex is like way too consistent. Of course, share that in the comments below. But otherwise, I think this is a great way to capture the feel and flavor of this character rather nicely. And I love the idea of this sort of like tug of war where you're really working to keep Naralex alive, and maybe running like a buff druid deck and you just have to keep buffing it, or maybe you're a priest, you just keep healing it. Your opponent can't quite get there, but they know they have to deal with it. And at like 5 health, starting off, it's not much, but you can really build that up. Some decks might have trouble killing Naralex, and then it's this race to kill you instead of having to kill Naralex, because you're maybe focusing on keeping the minion alive more so than keeping yourself alive. So that back and forth seems like it'd be a really fun sort of mechanic, this impending sense of doom with this card when it finally wakes up. So next up here is Verdan, the Ever Living from Katie Page, a nice druid minion. 5 mana, 2/7 legendary. When an enemy minion dies, sprout roots in its place that prevent minions from being played there. And this is a cool callback to the boss fight, I think, here for Verdan, and a little bit of a different spin. This was probably the most popular character submitted of all these custom cards. One I guess we won't see as a collectible legendary in Wailing Caverns. Most people went with the Ever Living aspect of this card and focus on like health mechanics or revive mechanics. Katie here went to the root aspect, which I think is really distinct and different, and earned the spot in the video. Now, when it comes to this effect itself, I mean, there's potentially some problems here, of course, right? Because if your opponent just played a small board and you played like Verdan and any sort of board clear, just like a Blade Master Samuro or whatever, you could potentially lock out your opponent's entire board and they wouldn't be able to play minions for the rest of the game. So maybe there needs to be something in place where these rooted board spots only last for like 3 turns or something, so that it's not like a permanent total disruption. Now, in Druid, that is unlikely. They don't have as many wide board clears as other classes might, so not as problematic. But, you know, killing 1 or 2 minions just with some good trades and stuff, a real possibility. And if you're going against a wide board deck, that could help shore up a weakness for Druid, lock out a few of their board spots so they can't go wide again, shutting down things like token decks or anybody that's just going really hard aggro like a Zoo style deck. Verdan could help you keep that in check until you get to your bigger late game crazy stuff. So, you know, maybe a little bit of a tweak here or there, cost adjustment, something with this effect to limit it. But nonetheless, a great callback to the character and a neat mechanic for Druid in particular, I think. All right, next up here is the Serpent Bloom Doom from Kogeti, a 4 mana Warlock spell referencing the Serpent Blooms you got to go around collecting in Wailing Caverns. And in particular here, this summons you 4/0/4 blooms with Death Rattle, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero. So these are basically, you know, leper gnome style things that you're going to summon. And 0/4 is like pretty awkward health total. Like you kind of want to kill them, I guess, but you also kind of want them alive because there are some mechanics in Warlock right now that are benefiting a wide board. In particular, you have Ritual of Doom. Yes, that is the card name in the core set, which wants you to have 5 minions on board and involves killing off your own minions. So having things like sticky Serpent Blooms could really help play into that playstyle. We've also got a few other egg support cards, Grimoire of Sacrifice, killing off your own minions for some sort of upside. So a card like Serpent Bloom Doom allows you to get those boards that your opponent is basically dissuaded from killing, while also putting out some aggression. If you just play this and then you wipe a board, twisting Nether later, that's 8 damage being dealt to the enemy face. So 4 mana deal 8's pretty efficient, but you know, you're sacrificing some onboard tempo because these are 0 attack minions. So you have to make sure the payoff is really there, or it's just not going to be worth it. But that's what makes this a pretty interesting and perhaps balanced card design, if a little bit scary still. So before we get into our next card, let's talk about our sponsor for this video. It's Keeps. Yeah, if you didn't know, 2 out of 3 guys will experience some kind of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35 years old. I've actually got like the opposite problem going on today, but something I still think about, still worry about. And if you want to prevent hair loss, the best way to do it is while you still have some. With Keeps, you can get treated right from home. You can talk to a doctor online and they'll send your prescription right to you. So I know my dream is to never really leave the house, and Keeps makes that possible. So if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, do something about it. For a limited time, you can go to keeps.com/Regis or click that link down there in the description for 50% off your first order. So moving on, next up here is another version of Naralex from the end turn button itself. It's odd we had end turn button reference in the previous Naralex, but anyway, this is a 1 mana 1/1. It's dormant for 10 turns, and then when it awakens, it summons you a 2020 Wailing Ancient, which is a big 2020 tree with taunt. So another reference here to Naralex waking up, this time using the dormant mechanic instead of the asleep mechanic that's in Hearthstone. So, you know, this one is pretty much guaranteed as long as the game goes on 10 turns. There's not that kind of like tug of war trying to kill the Naralex like in the other version. So just a different way to explore the same idea of being asleep and then waking up later. And the payoff here is basically you spend 1 mana, wait long enough, you're going to get a 2020 for 1 mana, which of course is pretty crazy. Now that said, remember, you know, 2020, you know, like certain decks would have a lot of trouble dealing with this, right? Others wouldn't care at all. Just rip a Siphon Soul and it's no big deal. You waited 10 turns and you kind of really did almost nothing. And in many cases, you know, having this take up a spot in your hand, you know, that's a card you had to draw that could have been something else. Overcoming that opportunity cost in games that don't often go to 10 turns wouldn't be worth it. So maybe a great card if played on turn 1, probably a card that's really, really hard to ever actually do anything in any other stage of the game. You play this on like turn 7, most games just aren't going to go that far. Maybe some really greedy control decks could run this. That said, doesn't really matter. I don't think this card would be good by any means, but it would be really fun, and trying to play off of this would be really cool, or summoning multiple copies of these. Just doing cool big payoffs with giant minions is the sort of stuff I love about Hearthstone. So may not be a competitively viable card necessarily, but would certainly be a really, really fun one. So moving on here, another version of Verdan the Ever Living, this time around from King Kuba. And this is a 3 mana 3/4 elemental for Demon Hunter with taunt and death rattle. If you didn't play this, return it to your hand with a permanent +3/+4. So this mechanic, of course, a reference to the death rattles being pulled into play off of things like Razorfin Beastmaster could grab you the Verdan, and it gives you this resource in hand that you can keep pulling out of your hand, or even theoretically out of your deck as well with that Speaker Blackthorn. I mean, even if you've somehow figured out a way to like resummon this, that's another way you could do it as well. As long as you're not playing it and it's dying, it's going to go back to hand and it's going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that's a really cool idea. Frankly, it might be a little too good as it stands, since this also has taunt as well. And Death Redeem Hunter is already a pretty solid deck. This would be a nutty high roll sometimes to get off of that Razorfin Beastmaster. Couple those in a row, this is going to absolutely just win games in its own right. It's also worth noting this is an elemental for some N'Zoth synergies there as well. So that's another like crazy big payoff and another way to summon this and get it back in your hand. So I think you maybe have to start with smaller stats on this one to make it feel balanced. To me, it seems too good as is, and even if you just have to play it, it's not a terrible minion sometimes. And then when it starts going off and starts chaining, it's crazy good. So maybe make the buff incrementally smaller. Maybe, make the base stats smaller, whatever it is. I do something to tweak the balance on this one, but from a mechanic standpoint and a character feel standpoint, absolute home run. Also just a great archetype fit for Demon Hunter. So a lot of cool things to like about this one. I would just tweak the numbers some, I think. So next up here, a minion from Rob K, the Servant of the Fang. A nice little druid, 4 mana, 2/6 with Battlecry. Put a minion to sleep until this leaves the battlefield. So kind of like a freeze style effect here with the Servant of the Fang. Basically preventing an enemy minion from attacking until they deal with the Servant of the Fang. So you can imagine this, your opponent has like a 3/3 on board as an aggro deck. Just plop this down, freeze the 3/3, and then they kind of have to push through the Servant of the Fang if they want to open up that minion. That might be awkward, might be annoying, kind of has like a pseudo taunt. Could also be used on some big stuff as well, just to stall out or shut down a turn while you're doing other druid things, ramping out, whatever it may be. So I don't think this is a particularly super powerful minion. It's kind of like a freeze effect that's maybe even worse than freeze in some ways. There was perhaps some additional intent here with until this leaves the battlefield as opposed to like until this dies. So, if there's like transform effects, does that count as it leaving the battlefield? I don't know. That's open to interpretation. Feel free to talk through that. But I just like the idea of playing off of the sleep thing in Wailing Caverns. It's all about being asleep. And it's a cool way to use that as a weapon as opposed to in a mechanic that's like waking up. So playing it from the other side feels rather fitting, and I wouldn't be shocked at all to see a card very much like this show up in Wailing Caverns. All right, next up here is Scum from Magic Milk, a legendary shaman minion. 6 mana, 5/6 beast this time around. Battle Cry, overload the enemy by 1 for each card they played last turn. And I love this, finally taking overload and doing something useful with it by applying it to your opponent and making it conditional based on cards they played last turn. Means that if a card like this existed in the meta, basically opponents would have to keep this in mind. It's almost kind of like a Galloping Savior or Rat Trap kind of card. They have to really be mindful of how many cards they're playing, like on their 5 mana turn when it goes into the Scum turn. So I like that counterplay aspect or predictability aspect of Scum existing. But if they're not mindful, or if they're a class that just relies on playing a ton of cards, think about like a rogue, for instance, you can maybe shut down a future turn while developing a little bit of a 5/6 here, or maybe even just like, they need to play a 10 mana card, Survival of the Fittest or whatever it is, and they only played 1 card last turn, but you can still just overload them to make sure they're at 9 and can't play whatever that big combo piece or card is supposed to be. So there's almost like a tech disruption aspect to Scum on top of the like just totally blow up your turn because you got greedy sort of thing as well, both of which are cool. And shifting overload onto the opponent feels like a great way to make the keyword actually relevant if kind of twisting it from its original intention. So moving on here to the Deviate Fairy Dragon from KJ93. This is I think it's like a rare mob in Wailing Caverns if I remember right. So it's kind of like a little mini boss thing. And spin on Fairy Dragon since it's a Deviate Fairy Dragon. It's only 2/2 this time, but it can only be targeted by spells and hero powers instead of can't be targeted by spells and hero powers. So it's opposites day. And I'll tell you how I'm interpreting that, but I'm curious to hear thoughts. I think this means that minion attacks or face attacks cannot target this. And it means that battle cries cannot target the Deviate Fairy Dragon. I think it has to be attacked and killed, or excuse me, cleared or killed by a spell or a hero power. So perhaps very good in minion combat where your opponent can't really trade into it. They need a spell to chip through it. And of course, some hero powers, just give attack and wouldn't even target this anyway. So, a bit of a disruptive sort of minion, something that's like sticky or awkward to deal with or could cause problems against some decks. Other decks wouldn't care at all. Just backstab their way through this or whatever it is and move on with their life because, stats aren't particularly great on this. It's more about just being sneaky or disruptive. And I think that's cool. Like, would this card get played? No, I think very rarely Would it actually make any sense? Is it cool that it exists? Is it a fun twist on a mechanic? Absolutely, and a fitting one at that. So finally, for our last card, it's Muyo, the Last Disciple from Verdan. This is another Naralex style card. It's 6 mana, 4/5, start a game, summon a dormant Naralex, and put Muyo on the bottom of your deck. When you finally get to Muyo, Muyo has a battle cry that will awaken Naralex, and when Naralex awakens, it will replace your hero, giving you a hero power, restore the Barrens. Whenever you should be drawing during your turn, add a dream card to your hand instead. So basically an anti-fatigue state where instead of drawing fatigue cards, you're going to draw dream cards every turn. This is kind of like a Niru style card, notably 6 mana, so you can't play the same turn as Niru. Could of course have both. You just got to spread them out a little bit. But I think this is a really fun sort of card. I love really grindy fatigue style decks. Just running your opponent out of resources. Getting to the bottom of your deck is awesome, and having a big payoff card like Muyo for that is cool. And then you start drawing dream cards, and you never run out of stuff. You can grind anybody out. I can't imagine what mirror matches would be like. Not even sure this is necessarily good for the game. It's just something as a content creator. That's what I like. I like those really long, grindy sorts of games. It's also noteworthy that Muyo is not always at the bottom of your deck, because you can shuffle your deck in Hearthstone. Anytime you put a card in your deck, say like a Mancrick, you're going to shuffle and you could draw Muyo sooner, which means you could be drawing a dream card every turn somewhere in the middle of the game, like play Muyo on turn 6 or drawing dream cards. Now, are dream cards better on average than your deck? Yeah, I mean, Sarah Awakens is pretty nuts AoE, but if you're only getting dream cards, that might actually be more of a problem, because you're not like drawing more, you're just getting one per turn, you know, getting dreams occasionally. It's like your opponent plays 2 minions, you draw a dream, you're behind on board suddenly. So if you get the wrong sequence, I don't know if that necessarily be a good thing. It might only be good at the bottom of your deck as opposed to the middle of the game, but hey, you could mix it up and try maybe just get a bunch of nightmares and stick a minion and kill them. But it's a fun secondary idea here for how to play Muyo. That said, another fun Naralex payoff, waking this dude up, having something really cool happen. That's clearly a story people want to see. I hope the actual Naralex card is something like this, or some sort of payoff for spending some time waiting and the dude waking up and something cool happening like this version of Muyo and Naralex. That said, that wraps it up for this video. Thanks everybody for watching. Of course, share your thoughts on these cards. How broken is this card, for instance, or is it actually totally fine? Yeah, let me know. What do you think? That said, we've also gonna do some that said, of course, we're going to do more custom card videos in the future, so check the description for a link down there to submit your custom cards. I think our theme next time is going to be Fang Keep, going from Wailing Caverns to Fang Keep, another World of Warcraft dungeon. So maybe some cool Fang Keep cards. Stay tuned for that future video and more Wailing Caverns cards, the real ones. But until then, thanks much for watching. Thanks to our sponsor, Keeps. And until next time, game on.